Hello and welcome. This is Data Exploration with Smart Mapping in ArcGIS Online. My name is Lisa Berry, and I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World team here at Esri.
I'm Jim Harris. I'm a product engineering lead on the Living Atlas team at Esri, and I'm glad to be here with Lisa to talk about one of our favorite topics. Now, some context for this. We all know that a map is often a major component of an application's user interface. And sometimes we use maps merely as a backdrop, like in the top right corner, where's this library? Well, here's a map that shows you right here. It's right here. And that's all we expect of that map. It doesn't have to do anything else but just look good. And other times we invite more exploration and query from our maps. We want a higher level of expectation about our map, like in the middle example there. Now the library is on top of another layer that shows areas with poor broadband access. Those areas in purple. Darker the purple, the poorer the access. So, okay, now we've put two layers together, but again, it's just a visual. But with applications, there's this opportunity to turn a map from a visually interesting thing to a functional thing. Like in the third map, imagine an app where you click on that library and everything else on the map fades to gray, and all you're left with is a 10-minute walk shed around that library and showing the areas with poor Wi-Fi access poor broadband access around that library. The idea being, I wonder if this library could serve the local community by offering free broadband and Wi-Fi, right? And that's the idea of that application. Now, that's a typical sequence of how maps go from a pretty picture to something powerful and useful. And you're the key. You developers and the developers you hire and work with, you're the ones who can turn a map from this static experience, almost like a paper map, to something dynamic and interactive. And when your customers, your users need something dynamic and interactive, they're going to turn to you to develop that thing. And so the idea of this session is to make and demystify some of the difficulty that usually, exists when you're trying to get a map to look good and be functional. And it's hard to find a developer who can do it all: write good code, design good applications, be a database expert, a query expert, a subject matter expert, a great cartographer and writer. Well, we can't fix all that stuff, or address all that stuff rather, in one meeting, one discussion. But we do want to simplify one part of your life, and that's how can I get a great map into my app in an efficient amount of time? And web maps and smart mapping are here to help. So what's a web map? If you don't know, a web map is in ArcGIS Online when you put some layers on top of a base map, configure their pop-up and set their colors and things like that, their labels. When you hit save, it saves something called a web map, and every web map has a unique ID, and you can pop that little unique ID into your code. And what's great about that, maybe in the past you're used to putting a map or a layer into your app via a REST endpoint only. And that's okay. A lot of REST endpoints will deliver a good map. And other times they just deliver data, right? Just kind of unformatted, unstructured, no labels, no colors, or no useful colors. And so when you just put a REST endpoint into your app, 100% of the burden is on you as a developer to write more code, to provide map symbology, map labels, pop-ups, charts, and other things. When you use a web map instead, you instantly gain more creative options and an opportunity to share your work with someone else. Meaning, I can develop the web map on screen, hand it to Lisa. She can put it in the code, and then Lisa could say, hey, I noticed the map doesn't have labels. Can you take care of the labels? I'm going to keep working on my code. And I jump into the web map, I make edits, add some labels, send her a quick message back. Okay, labels are added. She hasn't had to change her code. She's offloaded that cartographic work to me. And I like that relationship. Sometimes it's a very useful way to go. Because every web map has a unique ID, and the map viewer has purpose-built tools to help you author a map, filter the data, symbolize it, label it, query it, and more, we think it's a dynamite solution and a very efficient way to work to improve your map and get the most out of it.
And so within the web map, what is smart mapping, which is what we're talking about in this session in particular? Well, in its most fundamental form, smart mapping is the tool that helps you symbolize the data in your map. But as we're going to explore in this session, is that it's also a tool to find new patterns and explore different parts of your data. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is how you style your map. That's what it's called in the interface. It's either change style, and you'll see that you'll choose a drawing style. And what's cool about these drawing styles is that smart mapping will automatically look at your data first and only give you options based off of your data type. So if it's an integer or a double, it'll only offer you mapping styles for counts and amounts. If it's something else, it will only offer you things that are appropriate. So this is kind of where the smart part of it comes from. But as we were mentioning, this also helps you explore new patterns because when you dive into the interface within the options, smart mapping will automatically give you smart defaults based for the breakpoints of your map. So for example, this map is showing us the percent of Black or African American population without health insurance coverage. And you can immediately see these reddish pink areas are standing out in the map. And smart mapping actually helped us get there. If you look at the little blue box, everything in the red is actually, it says 19% or more. But what you don't know is that smart mapping actually already gave us important or statistically significant figures for this. It's telling us that 9 is the average, and then it's plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So all these areas in pink or red are significant values. So it's really taking the guesswork out of mapping, and you don't have to be a cartographer in order to make a map that's informative and also beautiful.
That's a great summary. I like how you explain that. These different map styles, they really do open up new doors to allow you to tell more stories. You know, sometimes until someone sees a map style, they don't know what's possible from this data or from your application or from this topic. So it pays to be someone who will ask questions. You don't have to be the expert. You just have to have access to one or be willing to do some research to find out everything you can about a topic as you put it into your map and you try to figure out what's useful here. We always try to integrate values that matter, like 98.6 Fahrenheit is normal body temperature, and therefore 103 degrees Fahrenheit as a body temperature. We all know that's a problem. Now, how did we all come to know that? Well, just over time, common experience. Well, what I want you to understand is not everyone knows what's quote unquote normal for the map you're showing. So be that person who helps draw that out. In the examples below, those are 3 maps of COVID. On the left is the count of COVID cases by county. Just a raw count, and that's where a lot of maps start. Let's start with the basics. But usually a good map will lead to a question. The map on the far left shows the count of current active cases, which leads to a question. Well, where is it sort of worse than other areas? And the middle map addresses that. Areas with counties with higher rates of COVID are shown in dark red. Areas with lower rates of COVID are shown in blue, and areas in between are kind of a yellowish orange color. And then the map on the right takes a weekly perspective and draws an arrow pointing up if the number of cases is going up, or the number of cases, or draws an arrow down if the number of cases is going down. So we want you to keep asking, what should this map show? Be that person who's interested in the topic and willing to ask those questions, because what it leads to, one good map leads to better questions, which may lead to additional maps, additional application functionality that you can provide. And what Lisa and I observe, interestingly, we observe that developers are sometimes hesitant about their maps exactly at the time in the project where hesitance is the worst possible thing, right? We need folks to explore, and that's what smart mapping does. It allows you to explore that data and find something that relates to things you hear the people on the team talking about.
So the basics of smart mapping in general, just mapping your data, is you'll usually start by visualizing an attribute within your data set. So that's before you even get started with that, on the top left, this is where you just show the points or symbols or polygons on the map. That's known as location or single symbol. But in general, if you choose an attribute that either has a category, which would create this map on the top right, which is types or unique symbol, or you would choose a numeric attribute, for example, that would be represented via either color or size. We think of these as kind of the fundamentals. You choose one variable and get one of these map styles. But what's incredible about smart mapping is that it opens the door to a lot of different ways to find new relationships, comparisons, and just general patterns that you may not have seen otherwise by the ability to combine some of these things that you see here, which Jim is going to now show us some of those examples.
Yeah, just visually on screen. The demos will show these in more detail, but these are some of the types of maps that are possible when you start to think about two attributes. Some of the best maps are found in between two or more attributes. Like picture a column of data with like total males, total females, and think of all the maps you could make from that. A map of total males, count. A map of the count of females. A map of the ratio of one to the other. A map of the percentage of males, percentage of females. I mean, I just rattled off 6 maps from 2 attributes. Can you imagine what you can do when you've got 3 or 4? What's possible? And that's what these map styles are for. Smart mapping helps you get to these styles quickly. They answer questions like, where are there concentrations of unemployed people in the top left corner, right? And I'm going to demo a few examples of this in a couple of minutes here, including useful map styles. They're all useful, but some of our favorites are things like the predominant style in the top right corner and the relationship style in the lower right corner, and their variations.
And beyond just mapping numeric attributes or categorical data, you can also more recently map your date and time attributes. If you think of time as a continuous timeline, you can answer questions such as, when were these buildings built? This example is just showing us buildings in Rotterdam, and you can see that the newest buildings are in a dark blue and the oldest buildings are in a light blue. Mapping that exact same attribute, you can also answer questions like, which buildings were built or rebuilt after the Rotterdam Blitz, which happened on May 14th, 1940. So you can see in this map, it's emphasizing everything before or after that date. And that way you can see that everything that was rebuilt after the Blitz is in brown, and any building that stayed standing is in gray. Using that same attribute, you can even map with size. Using that same date of May 14th, where are the oldest buildings that lasted through the Blitz of the war? And again, this map is just putting emphasis on the map. So these are 3 different maps that you can all create from one variable. Smart mapping makes it easy to flip between these and tell these different stories. You can also map with age, meaning how long ago did this happen, or how old is it? You're trying to find a distance between 2 different times. So in this example, you're seeing emergency response calls by their response time and age from the time the alarm was set to the time they arrived on site. And so the reason a style like this is really helpful is because all those areas that are bright orange, those are emphasizing the areas that it took the longest to get there. So these may be opportunities to intervene. What happened here? Why did it take so long? These are life and death situations. And ultimately, smart mapping helps us get the right information into the hands of the right people to make decisions on how to fix logistics and whatnot. Again, one more way to show this using the exact same variable is with size. So this one is emphasizing which ones really took the longest. So this map could really help us dive into the cases that, why did it take 12 or more minutes? I mean, these are how maps help us ask questions, like Jim said, but also start to answer those.
Yeah, developers who use smart mapping in their work, they tell us later that what they love about it is it helps them expand their map vocabulary. They feel confident that they can try things out rapidly, and that's why things like these themes on the left, within every map style, there's usually some additional themes that kind of refine the overall style into very specific, successful map styles. So the example here, the above and below theme shows data above and below a specific targeted value, like 0 is often a meaningful value, or the national average is often a meaningful value. Like here, if you look at the histogram with the color ramp, you'll see that it's got $62,800 as the national average. So everything above that is shaded in green and everything below it is shaded in purple, which allows us to talk about it in a very human term, or write about it in a very human term. Senator, I'm showing you a map of income in the area, and areas in green are high income, areas in purple are lower income, right? Real clear and straightforward. Not all the data is important. Some deserves to be filtered right out of existence on the map. Other parts of the data deserves to be de-emphasized so that the important stuff becomes very clear. And that's your job. Emphasize the important parts of the data, and if you don't know what's important yet, it's time to ask, or it's time to propose different things. Try each style, take a screenshot, send it to the user or the customer to help figure this stuff out. These themes allow you to quickly explore each of these options to start highlighting what's important in your particular map. And it's just as true with polygons as it is with points or with lines.
And in some cases, you may not even have access to the data, or you don't own the data, or maybe you got all the way to your mapping application and you say, oh no, I forgot to add a field. Well, with what's called the arcade scripting language, that's no longer a problem. This allows for on-the-fly calculations, and it can be used directly within your web map to calculate new values for the symbology, labels, transparency, pop-ups. You can do simple things to add two attributes together and explore those two attributes, and you can even do complex things. And at the end of the day, the web map will absorb what you calculate with Arcade, and it will use that directly within the web map. I'll be showing an example of that later. And just real quick before we get into the demos, I'm going to go over some quick mapping tips to keep in mind when you're on your own smart mapping journey. First one is we always recommend to start by choosing a base map, whether that be a neutral one so that you're not distracting from the data, or maybe you need an informative or contextual one. We always suggest to start by exploring the base map gallery before you start making your map. We also suggest making your polygon outlines a little thinner and lighter when you go through your process of map creation. You'll notice the green map on the left is very distracting with those black lines. But then with just a slight change of the outlines, the data itself starts to show up and you start to see the patterns and they start to emerge better. Another one is clustering your points. On the bottom right, you'll see sometimes you'll have so many points, it's hard to see a distinct pattern because they're overlapping. Clustering is actually a tool that helps you emerge new patterns as well and demystify the points on your map. And then the final one we'll just recommend that you try out is the attribute-driven transparency, which really helps, and again, emphasize patterns in your map by using an attribute to dictate how much you see a point or symbol on your map. And with that, we're actually going to jump right into the demos where we show you how to explore using the different styles in smart mapping.
This is going to be good. Be prepared to be underwhelmed by what it takes to get useful quickly.
To get us started, I'm going to get us acclimated with the web map and smart mapping within the web map. And like I mentioned in the tip I showed just now, the first thing I suggest doing is changing your base map, which is right here on the left panel. By default, you get a collection of different base maps available to you. You also can have your organization admin add different custom base maps, which you can see our admin has done so. You can even search the Living Atlas for different custom base maps, which is actually where a lot of these are from. My favorite is the human geography base map because of the way that it layers the data and creates a nice neutral background for my map. And so that's what I'm going to show here in this example. Then we need to add data to our map, which is a lot of times you have to go find data yourself, but with the Living Atlas, you actually have a lot of different content from all over the world, a lot of different category types that can get you started right away with your mapping endeavors. I'm going to show you guys how to find some census data for the United States. If you search the phrase current year ACS, you'll actually get a collection of thousands of different attributes that are available from the American Community Survey from the US Census Bureau. And these cover a wide range of different demographic topics to help you learn more about the population in the United States. So I may be interested in learning more about where the Black or African American population live in the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and add this race and Hispanic origin variables layer to my map. Once this is added to my map, and I go into the layers, you'll notice that there is states, counties, and tracts available for the entire United States from this layer. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and just show you guys the county layer example. And if you want to start working on a layer, you click it here on the left, and that will enable all of these options on the right toolbar. And if you click this second one, which says styles, that's how you get to smart mapping. So automatically you can see that this map is showing us the predominant race by county in the United States. Jim is going to show you an example of this later, so I'm going to go ahead and not stealing any of his thunder, but you can see that all these different fields were chosen from the data, and the predominant style was suggested based on the fact that smart mapping recognized this. I want to have a fresh start with my map, so I'm actually going to go ahead and just remove these. So essentially, I have a blank slate to customize as I so please. So to get started with your exploration, you just choose Field to access the different attributes within your layer. You can see in this one, there have been alias names added to help clarify the data. And since I'm interested in learning more about the Black or African American population, I could select this field to start mapping it in Smart Mapping. But one of your first lines of defense when learning about data you may have no information about, you can actually click this little I symbol right here and immediately learn more about an attribute. This one is an integer. I have some basic information about the alias and description. I can also get some basic statistics and information about this data directly from the table. So this is just kind of a nice intro into an attribute before you start mapping it. But since I've selected it, I choose to add it, and Smart Mapping will look at it and say, you gave me an integer, so I'm going to suggest the counts and amounts size style. Now, automatically we see this is actually just looking kind of a little bit like a population map, because it turns out where there's more people, there's more likely to be more Black or African American people. That's just an artifact of how demographic data works. One thing that we can do to start exploring this is go into the options, and automatically we can see the minimum and maximum value of this data and start to play with this to get some patterns to emerge. What I like to suggest is to just grab this upper bar, start dragging it down slowly. You really start to see different cities popping up. And this is just an easy way to explore any size map. You can also play with the different size ranges to find a combination that works well for your data set. But like I mentioned, this is a little bit of an artifact of the fact that there's just more people in a lot of these areas. So I'm also going to go ahead and go back here to explore a different attribute that's similarly related. I'm going to switch this attribute by clicking it, and it'll replace this field. And in this data set, there's actually also a percent of population that is Black or African American. And so I can go ahead and click that to replace it. And Smart Mapping says, oh, based off of this field data type, I'm going to suggest colors, counts and amounts colors. Now we're really starting to see a pattern emerge through this data. We're immediately seeing the south part of the United States really shine when it comes to where Black or African American population live based off of the percent of total population. Again, I recommend going into the style options. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this by default is showing us the average plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So we're automatically seeing this significant pattern. I also like to recommend going in and really playing with the different color ramps until you find one that either matches the topic that you're showing or just appeals to the cartographic view you'd like to show on this map. I'll also real quick show you guys how to do that transparency thing that I mentioned. If you choose transparency by attribute and select this, you can actually choose the attribute from your field as you would to just map it. And it's going to use those same statistics and provide a level of transparency so that it highlights anything above this upper bar, and it does transparency until it gets to that lower bar. So in this map, everything on that low end is going to get roughly 70% transparency, and now you really see where where the Black or African American population really lives because this emphasis was put on the map. So now what I'm going to do is show you guys how to combine those two styles that we saw. We saw color and we saw size. Right now we're seeing percent by color. If I go ahead and add back that total population of Black or African American, Smart Mapping will say, oh, I see you've given me these two different numeric attributes, and I'm going to offer you the counts and amounts, the color and size style. So now you see it combined those two different patterns that we saw, and if you go into options, you'll see you can edit the options just as you could before. So I could go in here and start to make those patterns really emerge within the map. I really like to use color and size. I think it's a really effective way to show both things alongside each other. But I'm going to show you guys real quick another way that you can show two different things alongside each other before Jim gives us a deep dive. So right now I'm showing both things related to the Black or African American population, but imagine I want to compare two different patterns. Say I want to replace this field with instead the percent of the population that is Hispanic or Latino. I want to compare where these two different race and ethnicity groups live in the United States. Now that I've selected them to do this comparison, one style I recommend is the relationship style. What this is going to do is this is going to put two different patterns on the map using this grid to show where there's high concentrations of one or the other or both. So this map automatically is showing us that there's a lot of Black or African American population in the South, which we already saw, but it's also showing us in this lighter color that there's actually quite a few percent of Hispanic population living in the western part of the United States. And then all these areas in brown have a high concentration of both, and the areas in this light color have a low amount of either one. So this was really interesting because we just within a few clicks learned a lot about different patterns in the United States, and we didn't have to necessarily have any prior knowledge about this data. Let's shift real quick to talk about another way that we can explore our data, which is with Arcade. So here's another ACS layer from Living Atlas, and it's talking about poverty in the United States. Since I've selected that, I can now go into the styles like we did before, and instead of adding a field, I can actually map an attribute that doesn't even exist within my data by clicking that expression button. This is the expression window, and anything I put in this expression pane right here, the map will translate client side and put it onto my map for the symbology. So here are all the attributes within my data, and imagine I'm interested in learning where the youngest children are who live in poverty, but I only have it as a count and I want it as a percent. I can click these and start adding them. If I divide it then by a normalization attribute such as total population for whom poverty is determined, just like I could in Excel, I can create really basic calculations right here within my window. I'm going to call this under 6 in poverty. And to see what this expression would create in the map, I can click test, and automatically it is giving me a number. And it gives me an example of what would be produced by this expression. So this field doesn't exist in the data already. I'm going to explore what this pattern shows me on the map. Smart mapping automatically says, okay, you gave me a number, and it gives me size. I can also try out the color pattern and immediately start to see new patterns emerging. Don't forget, this variable does not exist in my data, and this is just a really basic example of how Arcade can help new patterns emerge. If we want to see a success story slash more complex version of what Arcade could do, here's a map showing FCC broadband service levels in the United States, and this is by block. You'll see in this map that instead of seeing maybe typical numbers you'd see from broadband, such as upload and download speeds, it's broken into these categories. Now, this was done with Arcade and Smart Mapping in order to create a variable that didn't even exist within the map. So if we go ahead and go into this expression and explore what's here, you can kind of get a sense for what was done. This is a little bit, again, more of a complex example that uses variables and functions and different methods to classify data from a numeric pattern into these words that really describe the pattern in a way that makes more sense. It's averaging those upload and download speeds in order to turn them into a digestible thing. And so Arcade is a really powerful way to turn data into something that's easier to understand. And so that was just the basics of smart mapping and the web map and how you can get started. And now I'm going to transition to Jim, who's going to show you some really more advanced techniques of mapping multiple attributes and finding new patterns within your data.
Okay, let's look at some maps that use 2 or more attributes. I've got this nice map of Florida highways and roads symbolized by traffic volume and by district. The color represents what district each road falls into, and the size of the road indicates what volume of traffic is headed out over there. Now, if we start from scratch, how do we build this map? Well, we would start with the fields we're interested in. If I type district, I'll find that field and hit add. And Smart Mapping says, okay, that's a string field, so I'm going to suggest a map style called types. And if I add a second field into the map style, Smart Mapping says, oh, okay, so you have a string and a count? Okay, I have these styles to suggest to you. The current style it's using is called types and size. And from there, I can choose, well, what colors do I want to work with? I can choose, let's go look at what some of the bright colors are. It's very easy to just try on different sizes, or different colors. And if you don't like a particular color, just click on it to change it to a color you do like. So I'll give this sort of a soft purple color. You can also control the size. So if we jump in here, maybe I want to say at 250,000 cars per day, I want to reward that with a nice thick line, like 14 points or pixels wide. And at 1,000 cars per day, I'm going to say you get a 1-point symbol. And watch what happens if I, set that threshold higher and higher. Well, no roads get any thickness. And as I lower it, you start to see some signal coming into the map. And that's what we're after. So I'm going to set this at 1,000. And what I want you to notice is adjust size automatically is in play. As I zoom in, if you watch the legend, the sizes get thicker. As I zoom out, the sizes get smaller, right? So if I hit done, I'm done sort of styling that. The only other change I'd make to this map, it's so hard to make good maps on a dark background. So I'm going to change this to a lighter background like human geography map. And we'll put that on and hit save. What I like about that is then now if for argument's sake, if I were to say I'm done, I would go over to a code sample like this load a basic web map code sample. They have a sandbox where I can paste the ID of my web map in and hit refresh, and it's going to draw that web map in its native state or its default state. Now I noticed that I didn't do much work on the pop-ups, it looks like. So yeah, maybe I need to go back in here and choose my layer, and go to the pop-ups for it. And I want to add content. I want to add some text. I happen to have some text handy, it turns out. And as soon as I hit OK, I get a live update to my pop-up. So now it's showing the information I think I need to show when a user clicks on one of these important roads in the state of Florida. And what I like about that is I make that change, and whoever is developing the application, might be me, might be someone else, they're going to pick up that change right away. And that's a good working relationship. Let's get back to the map styles, however. Next example is clustering. In this case, we've got a field that tells us what kind of hostility in this piracy layer is shown. And we've all been here where we have so many points that we can't even see them all, you know. In this case, there's 21 where I clicked, and over here, there's 65 different points right underneath this tiny little circle. So what we need is something that helps bring out the information, because in this case, all those points, I mean, this map style as it sits is not actually communicating well at all. If we turn on clustering, well, now an invisible grid or mesh has been laid over the top of the map, and it's counted up how many features fall inside of each cluster or cluster radius. So if I want to make fewer clusters, bigger, you know, a more coarse grid over the top, I would go that direction. If I want more clusters, it looks like this. Smart mapping always tries to estimate what would be a reasonable cluster size at this scale, and it's multi-scale. So as you zoom in, more and more detail off the coast of Yemen starts to appear. The other thing I really like is the pop-up here. I didn't even have to write this. This map style automatically generates this pop-up to tell you how many features are in this cluster of 54, and the predominant type of hostility type list is shown. And I really like that because it kind of does a much better job of communicating the overall pattern going on there. And obviously we can take that, put it in our sandbox, and try it out to see how does it look. Looks pretty good. Next, let's look at some vaccination data from Johns Hopkins University. I downloaded this data from GitHub on February 2nd and was interested in the count of total vaccinations as of January 31st by each state. And I'm also interested in the total number of vaccinations given in the past 7 days as of January 31st. And if you notice, these two maps, I'm just toggling them on and off, they look about the same. And that's one of the challenges of just mapping a count is on a thing like vaccinations or COVID cases, this map just doesn't change over time, right? The numbers change, but the relative sizes just don't. So one way to get more value out of data sets like this is to calculate rates of things. An easy way to do that is to find a numerator and a denominator and use a style called compare A to B to get value out of that relationship. So total vaccinations is one count, and then there's a second count called total distributed. And if I use the compare A to B style, I can kind of reward anybody any state that's distributed 90% or more of their allotted vaccinations, and I can kind of call out any state that's at, say, 55%. I'm going to choose a color palette where green is good and purple is less good. So all the green states are above the average of the 50 states, and all the purple states are below the average of the 50 states. And as these numbers change day to day, you can come in and easily modify these to keep up to date. The other question I had is, what's the pace at which these vaccinations are being given out? And so I did a little extra calculation for each day in the Johns Hopkins data set. I calculated, well, how has this number changed in the previous 7 days as both a count, but also as a percent. So if we go find my field and add it, I'm now looking at a count and a rate. If I put the rate on top, This color and size option will use the number that's on top for the color, and it'll use the count for the size. I'm going to choose a style called above and below, and then I'm going to drill into that to kind of say, look, if you're at 1%, I'm going to call you out with a certain color, and if you're at, say, 3.4%, I'm going to call you out with a different color. And again, I'm going to use the same color palette so that we kind of develop a style here. And immediately what jumps off the map is how Virginia is giving out vaccines at a pace, 3.4%. They increase the percentage of people who've been vaccinated significantly over that time period, where states in purple are lagging behind. It's a very powerful way to go. In this next map style, we're showing what happens when you've got 3 or more attributes selected. I've got 8 categories of race as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau's data set. And because I have 8 numeric attributes, 3 different map styles are suggested by smart mapping. Let's go with the first one, dot density. Dot density is putting 1 dot down for every, in this case, 18 people on the map. So if I tell smart mapping, hey, these dots represent people, the legend over here now reflects that. And I like that. So each dot represents 18 people. I've got full control as a cartographer or someone interested in data to decide, do I want to have a very sparse look? If it's sparse in Chicago, it's going to be sparse in the suburbs and in the country. So what I generally recommend is kind of pick one area in the map, and you're looking for, look right above the word South Shore. You're looking for a setting where basically all these polygons fill up. And then you want to back it off to a point where there's relatively few polygons that are full of dots, right? It's okay that if a few of them are. And the reason I suggest that is when you zoom out, the software automatically recalculates, well, how many dots per person should I use at this scale, and this scale, and this scale? And so it's really about how do you want to make this work across 2 or 3 scales. It doesn't have to work across all 20 scales available in web maps. You just need 2 or 3 scales to work for a given data set. I really like how it handles that automatically for me. Another map style is called predominance. It's kind of the twin to dot density, whereas dot density is going to draw 1 dot to represent each race present in a census tract. Predominance says, you know what, I'm just going to give the full color value to whichever race or ethnicity has the highest count of people. So you can instantly tell which is the race or ethnicity, in this case, with the greatest number of people around the Chicago area. And then, of course, you can go in and adjust the colors to be appropriate for the topic that you're working with. This is just one of the defaults. There's many default color palettes available. I'll just pick that one. Normally, I would take the time to make sure each color is appropriate for the category given. And then lastly, you can convert it to a predominant category and size, which shows the sum of the categories. In other words, the total population which reported a race or ethnicity is now shown on the map as a dot. Why would you do that? Well, sometimes you want to kind of see where the drop-off is between urban, downtown Chicago, suburban Cook County, and the exurbs and the rural areas further out. Right? That's a nice set of options with just a few clicks. Let's go back to Lisa to wrap up.
Thanks, Jim. All right, so when you have forgotten everything that Jim and I just said, we actually have this collection of resources for you guys to visit when you're done with the conference or whenever. If you just access that URL at the top, it will actually bring you to these live links to a bunch of different resources that will help you get started with your own smart mapping journeys. So I'll give you a second to write that down, but there's lots of different things that you can use here. And with that, we thank you for joining us today, and we will now just be getting into the Q&A. And please don't forget to provide your feedback for this session. We really appreciate hearing what you guys have to say, and we will hope to continue to improve what we offer for our different conferences.
All right. Thank you, everyone, or thank you, Lisa and Jim, and welcome everyone to this live Q&A portion of this session. Before we dive into the questions, I just want to remind you that if we do not answer your question, you can ask the question in the Ask Our Experts section. So I encourage you to please go out there. We're out many Esri employees are out there monitoring those channels. So don't hesitate to go out and ask your question if we don't get to it today. Also, I wanted to point out that the slides that you saw in this deck are available if you click the link below the video. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll just take the question from the top. So what's the best way to allow users to set their own breakpoints and color ramps within web apps? I'll go ahead and answer this one since I work on the JavaScript API. In the JavaScript API, we provide more than a dozen smart mapping widgets, and those are widgets that help you configure your render, such as those continuous sliders and class break sliders. So in this case, if you have breakpoints, whether it's a continuous visualization or a class breaks visualization, you have sliders available to you that you can provide to your end user in any web mapping application, and they can use those to modify the render. And then you can save it back to the web map if you need to. And I'll post a link to a sample on that question as well. Okay, next question. Go ahead.
Can I add one thing, Christian?
Yeah.
Yeah, just conceptually too, think about also not just the technical aspect of setting the breakpoint, but also, Chris, you're a great guy for doing this. You often in your apps will provide the histogram of the data so that the impact of their choice is on the data, because we've all made that map before where you've got this beautiful color ramp, that goes from a color friendly yellow to blue on the entire map that can get that dark blue color. And you're kind of scratching your head. I don't understand why this map is more impactful. Often seeing that histogram of the data next to the choices the user makes helps.
Yes. So that I just posted a link as a reply to that question that shows an example of using the histogram with one of those sliders. Cool. All right, I'll go ahead and Lisa, this question is for you. Are there ADA approved for colorblind color scheme suggestions for the maps?
Yes, we have actually been actively working on this. In the new map viewer beta, there are, I think, over 200 colorblind friendly ramps that have been added. And when you're in the map viewer beta and you're choosing a ramp, there's actually a drop down that has an option to select all colorblind friendly ramps. And so that way you'll only get those options. And so that's one way to get those suggestions. And then the same ramps are also documented for developer use if you're actually coding them straight into your apps. And so but the links to both of those resources are actually within that question if you want to follow up and learn more.
Thank you. Jim, can you briefly address how do you access this new version of the map viewer? It looks like there's a number of people who haven't used it or haven't used it much.
Yeah, sure. The first step is log in. That ensures you've got access to it. So if you log in to ArcGIS Online, and I believe if you look in the top right corner after you log in, you'll see a little photo of yourself or some kind of avatar or something to indicate, yeah, that's where you logged in. And so in the top right corner, just next to that, there's a little icon with 9 dots. Christian probably knows the proper name of the 9-dot thing, but I'm going to call it the. When you touch that 9-dot thing, there's a list of all the applications you have rights to based on your login. And you'll see one called Map Viewer Beta. Right now, it's called Map Viewer Beta, and in a short time, it'll just called Map Viewer.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. Lisa, how can I change the pop-up for a cluster aside from showing the number of features within the cluster?
That's a great question. You can, within the clustering settings, access the pop-up specifically for the cluster. If your map is visualizing a numeric attribute, you'll also have the option to access the average value for the features within that cluster. And similarly, if you're mapping a unique symbol or a predominant symbol, you'll be offered the option to include the most common type for those two different categories. And so you have an editor, and you can customize that, and it's within the clustering settings. I also included a link to that one.
Thank you. Jim, will there be tools that aid in making more accessible maps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think smart mapping itself is a big step towards making more accessible maps. The way I've heard people talk about maps and accessibility, it's kind of like layering a cake. You know, there's many aspects to accessibility. And sometimes as map makers, you know, we want to put all the data we can on the map, and we want to use as many colors as we can to make sure you can see all the different things on the map. And that amount of color a lot of times can reduce accessibility. So I think smart mapping is a big step because of how it encourages you to use a more neutral base map if you're doing something thematic, or even if just showing a parade route. The availability of the color ramps that are colorblind friendly was mentioned, but also I want to point out, you as the map maker or whoever you're working with, you have a big role to play. You know, cartographers always talk about filtering out what is unessential, you know, the art of leaving just the essential on the map. And I know in my own GIS career at first, I thought, oh, I feel more secure if I put everything on the map, because then I probably didn't miss anything. And it's kind of ironic that cartographers tend to work the opposite way, to say, let's only put it on the map if it absolutely must be there. And then if it needs to be there as reference, you know, you kind of desaturate it, meaning take the color out of it so that whatever is important stands up. And then another thing to mention is, yeah, there's a whole team at Esri, and I hear them every week on the calls talking about improving, for example, little details like with labels, when you choose a label color, you know, what maybe a black font for your label, and then sometimes we put a halo around it to let it stand up on the map. Well, what color did you choose for the halo? If you chose a gray color, the black is not going to sit up well on that gray. So there's a lot of little details, and I think the new user interface, it'll actually give you little hints about, hey, these are good choices, or you might want to adjust that as just one ingredient in the overall accessibility picture.
Cool, thanks. I'll keep it with you, Jim, on this next one as well. There's actually two questions that are related. One is, does ArcGIS Pro have the same smart mapping capabilities, or do you plan to add it to Pro? And then does the Esri roadmap include adding the legend functionality to ArcGIS Pro? For example, dynamic clustering is spectacular. Also, the other smart mapping functionality would have been great when I was creating a bird atlas. So do you want to address the Pro differences and with ArcGIS Online?
Yeah, good. The question is, does it have the same capabilities? Yes. In many cases, you can emulate the exact smart mapping styles. I guess it's important in online, we really focused on their experience that starts with someone who is not a cartographer, probably is not a GIS expert. And our point of engagement was, hey, you've got this layer. Now, which of these attributes do you, which one? Oh, you want to show total population. Great. We make that map authoring experience go well forward, kind of offering different map styles to choose from so that you pick from that menu, and then you kind of keep refining it towards your final map. And I think we all know Pro has got every capability cartographically, data analysis wise, and everything. So the same capabilities are present in Pro, but it might take you as the expert a little time to figure out, well, how do I configure the exact same look and feel within Pro's more capable interface? There's more flexibility, more settings. I think I enjoy that flexibility of it. I've often thought about whether and others have as well, about whether it makes sense to have some kind of toolbar in Pro that emulates the simplicity of the smart mapping user experience as a starting point, but then you're still in Pro to then expand that map and go many directions. I think Christian And Lisa would agree with me that one of the things we enjoy is that behind the scenes, it's our expressions, it's the layers, it's the same capabilities, and we experiment. And I get excited about how developers can use to expand into new mapping styles in a similar fashion. And did I address the question for you, Christian?
Sorry, you're breaking up a little, Jim. Can you say that last bit again?
I'm going to stop my video for a sec. Did I address the second question about the atlas, bird atlas?
Well, that was just a comment about the bird atlas. About it would have been nice to have this capability when they were developing it. So I think you answered the question. I'm going to switch over to Lisa. We now have 5 minutes left. So there's a couple of questions that came through that are the same. Is Map Viewer available in Portal? And by extension, are the smart mapping tools available in ArcGIS Enterprise Portal?
Yes, I actually, as of Enterprise 10.8.1, Map Viewer Beta is available as an optional additional install. I included a link to one of those questions in there, but I'll make sure to add it to each question.
Cool. I'll go ahead and take these questions about Arcade. Are there plans to enhance the Arcade saving process, perhaps an autosave function? And also, there was one, let me see here, about the pop-up. Okay. So, in the classic viewer, I've used HTML source to create and format a table in my pop-up for Arcade. Return data. I could not find where this is in the new map viewer for configurational. So Arcade, yeah, we are actively developing a newer, more modern Arcade editor that you'll be able to use in Map Viewer Beta. This will allow you to, it'll have additional capabilities. We don't actually have that full list yet, but being able to reuse expressions easily, for example, would be part of that. So you author an expression in your style, your layer renderer, maybe you want to be able to reference that same expression within your pop-up. So we'll have easy shareability in there. So that's actively being developed right now. As far as HTML source, you need to go to the Ask Your Experts in ArcGIS Online to reach out to Paul Barker. He would be able to answer that more definitively. But that is something that we have discussed quite a bit. Just wanted to put that out there. Okay. So now we have just a couple minutes left. Let's see. And I see that you guys, Jim and Lisa, are actively responding, so that's good. I'll move to a question that hasn't been answered. Let's see. Do you have any good resources for mapping lines and linear feature analysis? It seems a lot of examples show good data grouped in polygons like counties, states, etc. The roads and traffic was a good linear example. I'm just looking for more ideas. Lisa, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah, Jim also put in a reply to that one, but essentially all the examples we show, the concepts are the same for mapping linear features. And what I would recommend is to try some of the multivariate mapping. So map a color with size, or try using transparency with your lines, to attribute driven transparency, but essentially adding size to any of those things, like you saw on the slides and in Jim's examples, those are a really good way for mapping linear features, especially if there are numeric values involved. And so that would be my biggest recommendation. There are a lot of resources for mapping color and size, relationship and size, predominance and size. And so the blogs are a good place to find those. Learn.arcgis.com has a bunch of examples, but essentially most of the things we showed today can also be applied to lines. Hopefully that's helpful.
All right. Time for one more question, and just to remind you, if we didn't get to your question, please go to Ask Our Experts and ask it there. Let's see, Jim. Oh, it just jumped around here. when the map from Pro is published to ArcGIS Online, will the symbology from Pro be available online? For example, some of the current Pro symbology doesn't go with the classic viewer. So it looks like the symbol gets downgraded, right, when they publish.
I've seen a little bit of that here and there. It's a better question for the Pro team to understand maybe which cases the type of symbology I think makes a difference, whether using SVG for your symbols, if they're point symbols or other symbols. So I have definitely seen some degradation here and there, and usually you can kind of work that out by altering the symbol type that you're using.
Yeah, and just to give a little historical context, they were forced to downgrade with previous versions of the JavaScript API, which is used by Map Viewer, because the JavaScript API simply didn't support them. Now we've added a lot more support for more complex symbols. So hopefully you should see some of those warnings and blocking things going away. And this other question, just to address really quick, things like hatched symbology is now supported pretty well in the JavaScript API. So you should be able to do that at some point in the map viewer if it's not there already. So with that, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jim, for this session. And thanks everyone for participating. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And please come to us with your questions after the session is over.
Thank you for joining, everyone.